but I want to point out a couple things to people about how the pundits and the people with a financial interest are trying to steer people away from bona fide solutions that we're talking about. And we have to face the fact that today there's nothing coming down the pipeline that's anytime imminent from the usual care, drug, vaccine, things of that nature. So I'd like to hit on that a little bit and just talk about some evidence on evidence-based medicine that goes back a good 15 years.
I want to mention that Sanofi and J&J, those larger pharmaceutical companies, they also are working on coronavirus vaccines with a backing from BARDA. But keep in mind that these vaccines, they are going to take at least 1 year to develop.
Dr. Austin, I want to cover sort of a different topic when it comes to the coronavirus, because the pundits out there are saying we have to rely on evidence-based medicine, okay? That these herbals, the vitamins are no good. And let me just show you an example. I'll share the screen here for a second. And so this came across in Forbes magazine. Wellness influencers are recommending high-dose vitamin infusions, including A, C, and D, to prevent and treat coronavirus. There's no evidence that these can help. In fact, using extremely high doses of vitamins can lead to kidney and liver problems. Using too much vitamin A during pregnancy can lead to fetal abnormalities. Well, you know, we're recommending good balance of high nutrient density to ward off any disease, from a common cold to infection to type 2 diabetes. And these are common sense things. So what I want to point out, Trent, is that the pundits with all the money behind them, the drug companies are very wealthy, oftentimes can get away with saying things that, just to discourage the public from trying anything other than their synthetic pharmaceuticals. So are you familiar with Dr. Ioannidis?
No.
I'd like to introduce you to him because he's a professor at Stanford. And not only is he a professor, but he's a chaired professor. So, he's 4 tiers up, very high stature professor. And he's written some interesting things going way back to 2005, where he said why most published research findings are false. And he delves into this by study bias, wrong endpoints, not really looking at the right things. And so, I won't go into this, but he goes into detail about how the major clinical trials, the randomized clinical trials, the gold studies, the gold standards, oftentimes do not have a positive result. And then you can spin the results with proper biostatistics, looking at relative statistics rather than absolute. And the criminal part of this is that, we're talking about the coronavirus, we're talking about China. The Chinese have a whole bunch of proverbs. One of them is fall down 7 times, stand up 8. And what you've done in those previous 7 times is you've learned quite a bit about what it takes to stand up. In the randomized clinical trials, there is no requirement to publish negative results.
Yeah, so you can keep falling down on your trials, and finally you get one where the data just happens to show a statistically significant result, and then you publish that one.
So it's a big problem. Let's see some of the other things. So here's his latest one: evidence-based medicine has been hijacked. A report to David Sackett, who is sort of the founder of the whole concept of evidence-based medicine. And I just want to say to the audience that, let me give you an example. The most recent cholesterol drug that just came out, I just wrote a blog on this. It's approved by the FDA, and it's being launched in March. And there was a major publication, I can't remember, the Wall Street Journal or New York Times or Washington Post, but they added as a preamble to the announcement that this drug is coming out, and it lowers LDL fairly well through a different mechanism than statins and these other drugs. But they say once it's launched, then they're going to start doing studies to see if it reduces cardiovascular disease.
And you and I have discussed that the whole cholesterol thing is a red herring. The statins do lower the risk of cardiovascular disease, but it's probably not through their cholesterol lowering mechanism. It's and that's why niacin, which lowers cholesterol, doesn't lower cardiovascular mortality, and others. So they're chasing down the wrong path here. Just like, you know, they're trying to clear out the plaques, the amyloid plaques for Alzheimer's. It doesn't work, you know.
So what Ioannidis says in this particular case, he didn't write about this study in particular, but this drug is being approved based on what's called a surrogate endpoint. In other words, they don't have to prove to get it approved. They don't have to prove that it improves longevity, mortality, or reverses disease. Just lowering LDL is considered so profoundly important that that's all you have to do. So people will be taking this drug with no evidence that it reduces mortality and no evidence that it increases mortality. But there'll be one thing for sure: it'll lower your LDL and it'll make every doctor happy. All I can tell you, Dr. Austin, I hark back to the same thing. There are more and more statistics that are saying vulnerable people, regardless of age, are the ones that are dying. And when you have the vast majority are so-called mild cases, it just tells you that the best protection, sure, a mask. You know, you always want to reduce exposure, but your innate and adaptive immune system and getting rid of stressors that can put a burden on that are always going to be your best defense. You know, on our previous video, I put up a slide on cod liver oil treating consumption, tuberculosis, spitting blood, and it reduced morbidity by 300% and mortality by 200%. And those are relative statistics, but it went from something like 8% survive to 15% survive. So that's, you know, that's a 7% change, but it's 200%, you know, going from 8 to 15, 8 to 16. It's a significant number. And that's a simple medicinal that would be criticized by a report like this in Forbes, sponsored by the major medical pundits. But this is the best way to protect yourself. If your diabetes, start working on limiting, and this is the best time to start rethinking what you're doing to support your own health.
Well, here's the thought I had, Dr. Lewis. The children are having very mild cases. They have a very young, robust immune system. Older people have a senescent immune system. Now, here's the thing we know, and you know this too. If you perform a fast for, you know, for instance, 3 days, you slough off those old senescent immune cells, and then when you begin to eat again, you regenerate your immune system. You begin to produce new immune cells from the bone marrow. So if you go through this cycle of fasting and eating, fasting and eating, you can rejuvenate your immune system. So would there be some benefit to performing some fasting? If you know the virus is coming to your area, would it be helpful to do some fasting to rejuvenate your immune system? It would be, you know, we're never going to get a double-blind placebo-controlled study on this because there's no money in it, but that it makes sense. That it would be worth doing. It doesn't cost anything.
This was as of February 11th, 2020, and I'll put the slide up. But in China at that point, which was fairly early on, relatively speaking, 1 death in the 10 to 19 group, 7 in the 20 to 29 group, and then we hop up to 60 to 69, 309 deaths. So, you know, it's obviously, and the difference between a young person is that their white blood cells tend to be very virulent. So their innate immunity, but their adaptive immunity is hasn't caught up yet. That's why they're susceptible to other things like cancer and things of that nature. But the primary thing, the white blood cells, which knock out these pathogens, is very strong in the young. So makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to me. And of course, what we're seeing with intermittent fasting is just a reduction in insulin resistance, diabetes, and then all the downstream conditions from that, including cardiovascular disease and cancer. So, you know, a lot of these things are exacerbated by our body trying to fight on multiple fronts, including any nominal viral burden that we happen to have at this moment.
If you know a worldwide pandemic's coming, for which there is no prescription medication that works, now's the time to consider researching ancient options. So, you know, back, what did we do before 50 years ago, before we had prescription medication? For thousands of years, people used the plants they had around them. And as an example, one of the plants I have growing in my woods is Japanese honeysuckle. It's an invasive species, but it's long been used in Asia as a potent antiviral. And there are many other options. And now would be a good time to look into that and get those things. If you're going to consider having those around, you might want to consider getting those now while you can. But we talked a little bit. There's a good book, Herbal Antivirals by Stephen Herod Buhner, I think is how you say his name. He's a well-respected herbalist, and in this book, this was put out before this particular COVID-19 crisis, but he discusses and summarizes some of the research on herbal compounds that showed activity in studies versus the coronavirus SARS, which came out in 2003. And this virus today is very similar to that. So if you apply what we know and what we learned from the SARS epidemic, you might be able to find some clues for options to improve your immune system, support your immune system in this current.
You know, I was just listening to a Mark Hyman lecture last night, and some supplements are necessary because the food supply isn't as good as it used to be. And canned foods may not have the same level of nutrition as fresh foods. So we want to have some supplements, in my opinion, on your shelf. And that would be the vitamin C, the vitamin D, the cod liver oil, a multivitamin with iodine in it, which is an antiseptic, but it also supports thyroid health. So these are the kinds of things that are well known and well published in the literature, not promoted because they don't have patent protection. You cannot patent a natural substance. So these are the kinds of things we have to deal with. The only thing that's for profit that has a lot of quote unquote evidence behind it are synthetic substances that can have a 20-year patent life and recover the cost it took to approve it, which is now $5 billion. So Dr. Austin, you and I cannot do a randomized control clinical trial on oyster mushrooms. It'll never happen, ever. So does that mean oyster mushrooms don't work for certain things? Not at all. Can we prove it in the standard of care based, evidence-based protocols? We cannot. But Dr. Ioannidis, as I talked about at the beginning, says a lot of that data is biased anyway, even under those $5 billion study arrangements. It's amazing how many of those trials never make it to the light of day.
Yeah, there's a lot of studies going on right now with the COVID-19 disease, and they're all looking at prescription treatments, prescription antivirals. But they're, as far as I know, they're not doing anything in humans with the herbal.
There's an Israeli study that says a vaccine is imminent, but the talk I listened to today, I mean, you have to go through preclinical, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. I mean, yeah, they'll fast track these things, but anybody who takes one of these antivirals for this in the next few months, let's say, is taking something that really does not have a toxicity profile well established. So it's a big risk. Yeah, if you're on death's door and it might offer some promise, you might take it. But if you're a mild case you would be ill-advised to take something that hasn't gone through the standard safety protocol of at least 2 years of testing to assert that, at least you don't have some immediate acute side effects that are very deleterious. And let's keep in mind that it's going to take a long time, if ever, for the coronavirus to exceed the mortality rates on an annual basis of iatrogenic deaths, which are deaths caused by medical treatment. So, and that's in the hundreds of thousands. So
there's too many surgeries and things like that going on for sure.
Yeah.
Well, so another topic I wanted to bring up to you in regards to the coronavirus is the possibility that when you get the virus, like most viruses, you become immune. With the coronavirus, this novel coronavirus, that may not be true.
Right.
There's a mechanism called antibody-dependent enhancement, and this has been studied and is in other certain other viruses, like for instance Ebola. This was a syndrome, and it's not that common, but this appears to be the case with this novel coronavirus, in which when you're exposed to the virus and you happen to recover, if you have a mild illness, you have a certain level of antibodies that provide some protection. Those antibody levels seem to drop pretty rapidly in some people, and then when they get down below a certain threshold, when they're in a certain range of below a certain threshold, where you no longer have immunity, but above a certain threshold, the virus uses those antibodies to gain entrance to the cell. So the people who get this disease a second time have a higher mortality. And this is one reason that they've struggled to come up with a vaccine for SARS. All the studies they did in the animals did worse when they were vaccinated. They had a much higher mortality rate
and
after vaccination.
You're calling this conundrum
antibody-dependent enhancement. And if you just Google that, if you do Google antibody-dependent enhancement novel coronavirus, you'll see a lot of references to that. So that might be something you can add for our viewers. Yeah. But it's a real thing. It's a real concern. And that's why we might have a first wave of this thing come through, and we might think, oh, we'll bury our 2% of our people and we'll be okay. Then when the second wave comes through, then we could be in even worse shape. When it's exposed to cold, dry weather, it hardens that shell so it remains more viable and lasts longer. So it seems to be spreading in exponential fashion in the community in the Northern Hemisphere, where it's winter right now, but we're not really seeing that exponential spread in the Southern Hemisphere. We do have cases in the Southern Hemisphere, but they appear to be from people who traveled from Wuhan or traveled from China. And it's a little early to tell yet. I would not be too comfortable saying it's going to go away in the summer, but we can hope that the numbers will go down. But I certainly expect then to see an exponential spread begin in the Southern Hemisphere in what is their winter or our summer, and then it's very possible that it can come back in another wave here in the Northern Hemisphere this next fall or winter. And that's what we saw with the Spanish flu, was 3 different waves that swept through the world, and it took 18 months for this thing to kind of run its course.
Right. And it did, and the communication wasn't as great as it is today. Population wasn't quite as concentrated, but people lived in pretty poor conditions: coal, wood, poor sanitation, poor access to really clean water, things of that nature. So we might have a leg up over the Spanish flu. So
that influenza seemed to, when it first came out, the fatality rate wasn't terribly high, but then it's about 6 months, I think, into the illness, it suddenly the mortality rate shot up. And when it first came out, it was killing mostly older people. And then during the second phase of the second wave, it began to kill people with who were young and healthy. A lot of soldiers, 18 to 25 years old, with the healthy immune systems, they developed this cytokine storm. And
World War I was postponed.
We didn't have enough soldiers left to fight. Too many of them had the flu.
Yeah, amazing.